A man draws his service weapon at a gas station in a small Siberian settlement just to keep a crowd of exhausted drivers from surging forward. Nobody fired, nobody had to. The gun coming out was enough to remind everyone standing there that they were, all of them, still waiting for fuel that might not come. That's not a scene from a disaster movie. That's a documented incident from a town called Ust-Ordinsky, reported by the independent Russian outlet Meduza from just a few weeks ago. And it's one small piece of something much larger happening across the entire Russian Federation right now, a fuel crisis so severe that the Kremlin's own polling organizations are recording the sharpest collapse in public trust since Russia announced military mobilization back in 2022. Let's build this from the ground up because the scale of what's happening in Russia right now is easy to undersell if you only catch the headline. Start with the roads because that's where this crisis is most visible. Across Russia, cars have been lining up for hours outside gas stations, sometimes for most of a day, in queues long enough that some local governments have had to bring in extra police just to manage the crowds. President Vladimir Putin himself has publicly acknowledged the problem, not spun it, not denied it, acknowledged it directly in a televised meeting with his own government ministers. You are well aware that problems for drivers and for businesses persist, Putin told the meeting, according to Russian news agencies. That is about as close as this administration gets to admitting a crisis is real. And it is real, and it's been building for months. Analysts, including Chris Weafer, CEO of the Macro Advisory Consultancy, estimate that roughly a third of Russia's oil refining capacity is currently sitting offline. Gasoline production specifically has fallen sharply, down somewhere between 17 and 25%, compared to the same period a year earlier, depending on which industry estimate you're looking at. And according to Bloomberg, overall refinery processing volumes across the country have dropped to around 4.69 million barrels a day, the lowest level Russia has recorded since December of 2009. 16 years of energy infrastructure development, and the country's refining output just fell back to where it was during the depths of the global financial crisis. Here's what's driving it. Since the second half of 2025 and accelerating hard through the first half of this year, Ukraine has run a long-range drone campaign specifically targeting Russian oil refineries, storage depots, and fuel terminals deep inside Russian territory far behind the front lines. This isn't a scattered handful of lucky hits. According to an Associated Press count, Ukraine has carried out more than 50 reported attacks on Russian energy infrastructure since March alone, with several major facilities struck more than once before repair crews could even finish patching the last round of damage. Sergei Vakulenko, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, described the pattern to the AP in stark terms. Ukrainian drones are working an entire arc of refineries, he said, stretching from Ryazan south of Moscow all the way down to Volgograd, precisely the corridor Russians drive through on their way to Black Sea resorts, precisely the region where much of the country's grain harvest operations are concentrated, and one of the most densely populated stretches of the country to boot. This is not a campaign hitting Russia's periphery. It's a campaign running straight through the industrial and agricultural core of the country. The Moscow region hasn't been spared either, and this is where the numbers get genuinely startling. Moscow's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, reported that between July 11th and July 18th alone, nearly 1,900 Ukrainian drones, 1,892 to be precise, were detected heading toward the Moscow region in a single week. Most were intercepted at long range by Russian air defenses well before reaching the city. 207 were shot down as they closed in on the capital itself. On the night of July 18th specifically, more than 370 drones were flying toward Moscow at once. This is happening in the capital of a nuclear-armed power, hundreds of kilometers from any front line on a scale that would have sounded like fiction a year ago. And on that same night, July 18th, Ukraine executed one of its most significant strikes inside Russia in over 2 years. Long-range drones hit two massive logistics warehouses belonging to Wildberries, Russia's largest online retailer, often described as the country's answer to Amazon. One warehouse in the town of Kotovsk in the Tambov region caught fire. The other in Elektrostalbinai, or roughly 50 kilometers east of Moscow, close enough that the smoke was visible from inside the city limits, was one of the company's largest logistics centers in the entire country, covering more than 360,000 square meters. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the facilities weren't purely civilian targets, that they'd been used to funnel sanctioned components for drone production and navigation equipment into Russia's military supply chain, alongside the ordinary consumer goods the company is known for. Here's the part that matters most and the part that's easy to gloss over in a story built around economic statistics. People died in that strike. Regional officials confirmed at least 8 to 9 people were killed and more than 60 injured across the two warehouse sites, described by local officials as among the deadliest single nights of Ukrainian strikes inside Russia since the war reached this phase. A separate drone strike that same night hit an oil storage depot in nearby Noginsk, sparking a fire large enough to force the evacuation of a maternity hospital and a nearby residential building. Russian analysts have since estimated the total economic damage from the Wildberry strikes at somewhere around 100 billion rubles, roughly $1.3 billion US dollars, making it one of the costliest single strikes on Russian commercial infrastructure of the entire war. Now let's talk about what happens to an entire country when its refining capacity collapses by a third, because the fuel crisis doesn't stay contained to gas station lines. It moves through the whole economy like water finding every crack in a foundation. Start with the government's own response, because it tells you how serious the Kremlin considers this. In June, Russia imposed its first-ever ban on jet fuel exports, a restriction the country had never once put in place before, even during previous fuel squeezes, running through November 30th of this year. Gasoline exports have been restricted since January, and Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak has publicly acknowledged that a full ban on diesel exports as well is now actively being weighed, on top of everything already in place. Novak's own words, delivered directly to Putin in a government meeting, were that the situation is challenging but under control. An assessment that reads very differently once you know his ministry is simultaneously fast-tracking legislation to subsidize gasoline imports from India because domestic production can no longer cover domestic demand. Russia, historically one of the largest fuel exporters on the planet, is now in the position of having to import processed gasoline from the outside world. Industry sources told Reuters that Russia would begin importing fuel from Asia by sea, and Russian lawmakers have reportedly been rushing through tax legislation specifically designed to help fund those imports from India. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan, a close economic partner and neighbor Moscow might have expected to lean on for relief, has instead moved to extend its own gasoline export ban through May of next year, protecting its domestic market rather than opening the taps for Russia. When a country's own regional allies start protecting their own fuel supplies from you instead of sharing them, that's a fairly unambiguous signal about how tight this market has actually become. The human toll of the shortage is visible in ways that are hard to script around because they're happening in real time, filmed on ordinary people's phones. Videos obtained by multiple outlets show fistfights breaking out at Russian gas stations in region after region, arguments over cutting in line escalating into shouting matches, and in some documented cases, into actual physical violence. In the town of Serov, video shows a man punching a woman after an argument over queue position. In Ryazan, a fight broke out directly on a station forecourt as drivers waited for fuel that hadn't arrived. And in Chita, local authorities made a decision that's generated its own wave of public anger, giving participants in the war in Ukraine and their family members priority access to fuel ahead of everyone else standing in line, a policy that, according to Medusa's reporting, has deepened resentment rather than calmed it, because it means ordinary civilians are being asked to wait longer specifically so the war effort itself can keep moving. Behind all of this sits a number that captures the mood of the country better than any single incident can. Russia's own polling data, and this is important because some of this comes from pollsters that are close to the Kremlin, not adversarial to it, shows the sharpest weekly drop in Vladimir Putin's approval rating since the 2022 mobilization announcement. The Public Opinion Foundation, a pollster with close ties to the Kremlin, recorded approval falling from 71% to 66% in a single week. The independent Levada Center has tracked a slower but steady slide from 80% in March down to 74% by June. And Levada's separate consumer sentiment index, a measure of how Russians feel about their own financial future, fell below the 100-point threshold that separates optimism from pessimism for the first time since October of 2022, the same month as that mobilization announcement. Over the past year, that index has lost 23 points overall, 9 of them in just the last 2 months, the exact window this fuel crisis has been accelerating. When asked how they expect the country's economy to perform over the next year, the share of pessimists has more than doubled compared to a year earlier. This isn't a single bad poll, it's a trend line, and it's been pointing in the same direction for months. It's worth being precise about what these numbers do and don't mean. Russian polling, even from organizations widely regarded as independent like Levada, comes with real limitations in a country where public criticism of the government carries genuine legal risk. A 66% approval rating would be an extraordinary result for almost any elected leader in the democratic world. But for Vladimir Putin specifically, whose approval has generally floated in the high 70s to mid-80s throughout most of the full-scale war, a sustained slide into the mid-60s. With the sharpest single-week drop recorded since the mobilization crisis of 2022 is a meaningful signal, not statistical noise. Even a state-owned pollster admitting that kind of movement suggests something in the underlying public mood has genuinely shifted, not just that people are more willing to complain about gas lines than about the war itself. And that's really the core of why this fuel crisis matters, beyond the inconvenience of a long line at the pump. For years, the arrangement between the Russian state and the Russian public has functioned on an unspoken bargain. Stay out of politics, and the state will keep daily life stable and functional. A fuel crisis doesn't just cost money. It breaks that bargain in the most visible, most personal way possible, in the car, at the pump, in front of your own neighbors on a Tuesday afternoon, that has nothing directly to do with the war on the front line and everything to do with a war that Russia's own economy is now visibly straining to sustain. Ukraine's own framing of this campaign has been consistent throughout. The goal isn't simply to inconvenience Russian drivers, it's to degrade the military logistics network that depends on the exact same refined fuel supply that civilians are competing for at the pump: diesel for supply trucks, jet fuel for aircraft, the specialized fuel grades that keep armored units moving. Every barrel that doesn't get refined because a distillation unit in Ryazan or Volgograd is offline is a barrel that isn't reaching either a Russian civilian's tank or a Russian military vehicle's tank. That dual pressure, squeezing the economy and the war machine through the same choke point simultaneously, is what makes this campaign different from earlier. More scattered Ukrainian strikes on energy infrastructure going back to 2024. Where this goes next is genuinely uncertain, and we won't pretend otherwise. Russia still has real levers left to pull: emergency imports, further export bans, downgraded fuel quality standards to stretch existing supply further, and a domestic security and information apparatus well practiced at managing public anger before it becomes public organizing. Analysts at the Carnegie Center and elsewhere have been careful to note that Russia's fuel crisis, however severe, is not the same thing as Russia's collapse. The war in Ukraine remains the Kremlin's overriding priority, and there's no indication yet that fuel shortages alone will change that calculus. But a country that has never once in its history banned jet fuel exports is now doing exactly that. A country that built decades of political stability on cheap, abundant energy is now importing gasoline by sea from India at a steep markup. And a Kremlin-friendly pollster is recording the kind of approval swing it hasn't seen since the last time this government asked its citizens to sacrifice something they weren't expecting to give up. We'll keep tracking this as it develops, because a story built on refinery capacity, export bans, and approval polling moves slower than a battlefield headline, but it may end up mattering just as much to how this war actually ends. If breakdowns like this, the kind that separate a documented fistfight from a fabricated statistic, are useful to you, that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.